Hey, welcome to Radiant Midweek. Here we go. You know, at the time of making this podcast, we're quickly approaching the Christmas holiday season. And for many, it's a time of lights, sounds, holiday smells, joy, and laughter, and, well, if we're being honest, gifts. Lots and lots of gifts under the tree. And of course, advertisers abound this time of year. People I haven't heard from for a long time suddenly are in my inbox. The banner ads from companies I haven't done business with in a while suddenly appear, and they're focused on the shiny toys of the season. The jewelry stores are desperately trying to get your business. Car companies have big red bows on the vehicles. Our marketing system is abuzz. And the truth is, we like our stuff new. It's shiny and bright, and we're impressed by bigger, shiny, and more luxurious and expensive things. Several of the popular podcasts on YouTube, in fact, include tours of these multi-million-dollar homes that are just amazing, beautiful works of art. There was even one the other day I saw for a $1 billion yacht. I have no idea what to do with a $1 billion yacht, but apparently somebody has one out there. And so as we look around the world, we admire humankind's accomplishments. As man-made buildings and objects meant to impress, we're fascinated by unique architecture. Many people stand in awe of what we've accomplished. And why not? I mean, it stands as a testimony of humankind's creativity. After all, God gave us these gifts and these talents to create, and architecture, unique structures, impressive designs can all be an act of worship to our God when done properly and for the right reasons. And while buildings are often built for specific purposes, such as housing or office space or government use, buildings and structures are sometimes meant to impress or complement the area or the landscape that they're in. They can be a work of art meant to evoke feelings of awe and wonder. So let me ask a question. What impresses you? What gets your attention? What gives you a sense of awe and wonder? As we pick up our story in Matthew 24, I'm going to read from verse 1 again. It says that Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things, though?" Jesus asked. "Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." It continues, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples then came to him and asked privately, "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" A lot to unpack here, and let's just start with first things first. It says that he departed, or he left the temple. Now, we talked about this last week in our podcast. Jesus was leaving the temple. It was a picture of the Spirit of God leaving in Ezekiel chapter 10. It was the end of Jesus's public teaching ministry, and Jesus wasn't going back. We talked about that as he left, he would go through the east gate, the beautiful gate. He would cross over the bridge of the Red Heifer over the Kidron Valley, and he is on his way to the Mount of Olives. Now, for those who are curious, the Mount of Olives is about 1.3 miles due east of the temple, so it's about a 25 to 30-minute walk. And to clarify, again, another geography lesson, Israel has three main mounts or mountains. The first one is Mount Moriah. That is where the Temple Mount currently resides. It is where the legend tells us that's where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac. There is also the Mount of Olives, where Jesus is headed. It's located to the east of the Temple Mount. Some key things there. That's the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus wept tears of blood. It's where he was arrested. It is also where Jesus ascended back into heaven. Now, to the south a little bit of Mount Moriah is Mount Zion, which is the highest point of the three. This is where Jesus had the Last Supper with his disciples, and this is also where Jesus is pictured in Revelation chapter 14 as returning. So let's talk a little bit about the second temple, if we could. From a human perspective, it was quite impressive. The Temple Mount was about 450 acres, and to put that in perspective, that's about 25 football fields. Actual size is about 1,600 feet wide by 900 feet broad, and the temple itself was about 9 stories high. The walls surrounding it were about 16 feet thick, so they were enormous. There were 10 entrances to the temple, several courtyards, ritual baths, and pens for the sacrificial animals in waiting. However, when we talk about the second temple, it wasn't always this way. In fact, it said when the second temple was originally built, it wasn't quite near the splendor of the original temple, and it's recorded that those who had seen the first temple and then saw the second temple, they wept. In fact, in Haggai 2 and 3, it says, "Ask them, who of you is left who saw the house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem like nothing?" So there's a very real sense that the original second temple was nowhere near the original glory of the first century. And let's back up a little bit further here too, as we often need to do, and just cover a little history so that we get a proper perspective of what's going on in this entire conversation. The first temple was destroyed, as we've spoken of before, by the Babylonians in 586 BC. And the Jews of the kingdom went into exile. Many were killed. Some were left behind, but Babylon kind of came in, took the best and the brightest. That was where Daniel came from, and took them back to assimilate them back into the Babylonian culture. However, in 538 BC, during the reign of Cyrus the Great, and this now being Persia, the Jews returned to Jerusalem and they began building the second temple. It was, and this is important to note, it was on the site of the original one that had been destroyed. There is some interesting theories and debates out there today that the temple is not actually supposed to be located on the Temple Mount that we know of today, that it was somewhere else. However, their theory does not have a lot of weight. For instance, we know that the original one that had been destroyed, the new one was built on the same site. How do we know? Well, the Bible records that there were people alive who remembered the first temple. That's in Ezra 3 and Haggai 2, as we just read. That they wept again upon seeing the foundation laid, and this therefore negates any argument that the temple was somehow put in the wrong spot, as some claim. They knew exactly where the temple needed to be, and there were people alive. Again, when the temple foundation was laid, who knew the right place, the right spot? In fact, it was built on the original foundation. Some claim that the first temple, however, is down in the city of David, which is at a lower elevation than the Temple Mount, hundreds of feet below. However, there's several promises from this, and we don't have time to go into all of them. This could be a podcast to itself. But there are remains from the first temple and the second temple hundreds of feet above the city of David. And as a general rule of archaeology, and quite frankly, gravity, ruins don't fall up, they fall down. So it doesn't make any sense that where they theorized that the Temple Mount would be, that there would be destruction from the original 2 temples up above this. Things fall down, they don't fall up. So the point to all this is the temple has always been on Mount Moriah, and if another one is built, that's where they expect to build it. The second temple was completed sometime around 516 BC, and as I said, it was disappointing to those who had seen the original one. However, major renovations were made during King Herod's time, several hundred years later. And many would say that this amounted, honestly, to a complete rebuild of the temple. And this began around 20 BC. It would finish around 64 BC. Therefore, the work was ongoing even in Jesus' time. When they were walking around and the disciples were amazed by what they saw, they would have been admiring a temple area that was under construction. Now, what are some of the changes made? Well, interestingly enough, the area around the temple was doubled. They did this by expanding the Temple Mount on Mount Moriah, and you can even see where some of the seams where the old construction meets new construction occur. Even today, those are obvious. They made major repairs to the foundation during this time. A great deal of gold was added to the temple, much like the original first temple. In fact, in the Biblical Archaeological Review, it says, how much gold decorated the temple is a matter of debate. Josephus describes the temple facade as covered with massive plates of gold and writes that a large golden vine hung with golden fruit above the large door leading to the inner sanctum. And so the entire facade of certain areas of the temple were covered with gold. Inner gates were gleaming with gold. There was golden vines above it. There were golden doors. What wasn't overlaid with gold then had a facade of white marble stone throughout. And so the temple from a distance, you can imagine in the sun between the gold and the white marble, just shone brightly above everything else nearby. The temple itself was also raised and enlarged. A large royal stoa was added. That's a public meeting area, a very Roman sort of thing to do. It's probably, there's a very good chance, although the Bible doesn't say this, but most likely this is where Jesus chased out the money changers when he was cleansing the temple. Other large bridges such as, or other large structures such as bridges, porticos, towers, and additional entrances were added for traffic flow to the complex. Fact is, it was really an impressive structure. It was the largest structure of its kind in the Roman world. It rivaled the Villa Jovis, and so it was a great work of art. I kind of think that had the Greek historian Herodotus been alive, and he's the one who created the original list for the wonders of the world, I'm guessing that perhaps Herod's temple and the improvements made would have made that top ancient wonder list when it came out originally. So yes, the second temple was truly impressive. The Jews were proud of this amazing accomplishment. It was done primarily to build up Herod's reputation. So again, it brings in some motivations here. Was this to worship God, or were there more political reasons for this happening? However, it was his crowning achievement, and Herod was known as a great builder. But Herod the Great, as he's known by, was also a tyrant. This is the same guy who slaughtered babies when he heard Christ was born. He executed several members of his own family, including his wife Miriam and her family, and all the children born to her. He had many of his subjects killed on suspicion of plotting against him. And 5 days before his death, he executed his own son because he was a contender for the throne. And yet he's called Herod the Great. And I often wonder if our definition of great may be different from God's definition of great sometimes. How do you define great? Remember, the Bible reminds us our thoughts are not God's thoughts. Our ways are not God's ways. Humans look on the outside while God looks on the inside. And often we're so focused on our earthly definition of greatness and amazed by human wonders and things of our making rather than the beauty and majesty of God. And the truth is, we're puffing ourselves up. It's arrogance. We're impressed by our greatness and by what we've done. And in that arrogance, it can distract us from being impressed with God. Unfortunately, this temple wasn't necessarily built out of dedication to Yahweh. It was a political strategy meant to show the greatness of Herod and display the power of Rome. During this time, it's becoming a bank. It's a legal system. It works with political hierarchy. It had its own police force and a monopoly on higher learning at the time. If you wanted to go up in society, if you wanted to raise your stakes in life, the only way, there were no colleges, there were no universities, you had to go through the temple system. And they only picked the top 1% of the 1%. And so the priests during this time were also getting rich off the money, exchanging the money, which is what Jesus was upset about, the purchasing of proper sacrifices, because you could bring one, but if you needed to buy a good sacrifice, well, they could help you out with that. They would charge you for certain cleansing rituals and things when you were sick or injured or so forth to make you ritually clean. And there were other forms of revenue as well. It's no wonder Jesus was upset. This had turned into a business. And here's the thing, though. While the disciples are sitting around showing him this amazing temple and how awesome and wonderful it was, Jesus wasn't impressed. It's interesting that the things that impress us don't always impress God. And the one thing that is still certain amongst the disciples, they still don't necessarily have a good understanding of who Jesus truly is. I mean, can you imagine with me You're walking around and you're showing God's Son, the creator of the universe and all things, all your cute, tiny little buildings that you made. I mean, it's a bit like a 7-year-old showing off their Lego set, you know? And we have to remember, when we go to John 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He, that's Jesus, was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. And so you can only imagine they're sitting here walking around showing the creator of the universe how you improved upon the rocks that he made. I mean, see what we did with our fancy little hammers. Isn't this amazing? And you can only imagine what Jesus could be thinking. You know, in the South where I grew up, you know, we have a saying, you know, bless your hearts. You know, you can only imagine you saying, like, bless your hearts. You know, you've got this nice little building. That's pretty good. You've been busy. Great job. But have I shown you the Victorian Falls? Have you seen Mount Everest, by the way? What about the Grand Canyon? That's pretty big. The Great Barrier Reef or the Amazon rainforest? Have you ever seen a nebula or a black hole? God's beauty is put on display all around the world. Just look at the majestic snow-capped mountains, the flowing rivers and streams, the beautiful forests and rainforests, colorful flowers in bloom, the variety of animals, both big and small, throughout the world, those who swim, those who fly, those who crawl. It is startling. But when was the last time you were truly in awe of Christ's creation? The reality is, and what we can't miss in the story, that God's not impressed by our building projects. We go to Acts chapter 7, for instance. Notice what it says. It says, however, the Most High does not live in houses made by human hands. As the prophet says, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or where will my resting place be? Has not my hand made all these things? In Exodus 20, God instructs them. He says, make an altar of earth for me and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, your sheep and your goats and your cattle. However, wherever I cause my name to be honored, I will come to you and bless you. If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it. So let's ask, why would a tool defile it? Well, truth is, it's as if we're fixing or try to improve upon God's creation. I mean, isn't that rock beautiful enough without us changing it? God wants us to admire his beauty, be impressed by his creation. He built that stone. And that stone doesn't need our help to make it more beautiful. Because the problem is we can move from worshiping God and keeping our focus on him to suddenly worshiping and admiring our changes, our creation. What are we admiring? Is it God's creation or our own? And I wonder how often we're impressed by our own creations and not impressed enough by God's. So don't miss this. This is, in fact, the spirit of Babylon at work here, where we get our name, Escaping Babylon. Remember, in the Genesis story, they were going to build their own building made by their own hands that took them to the heavens. It would be higher than the floodwaters could reach. They would make a name for themselves apart from God. And this is the spirit of Babylon that was scattered throughout the world when God confused their languages. And that spirit of Babylon, a spirit of self-reliance and defiance, is still at work throughout the world. And so I imagine what Jesus says next alarms the disciples, because they're impressed by the temple and they're calling attention to it. So you can imagine how surprising it was when Jesus said, do you not see all these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. He tells them, not one stone. And now he's answering their first question that they asked, when will this be? And this happened during the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, which we've talked about. Jesus would predict 40 years before that this temple would be torn down and not one stone would be left on another. This also then confirms that he is the great prophet that Moses predicted would come and challenge us to listen to. Jesus' words are true, he can be depended on, and the Bible is a reliable source for prophecy. We should pay attention. He was warning his disciples that an era or a time was coming to an end. And in 66 AD, as many of us may remember the story, the Jews led a revolt initiating the First Roman-Jewish War, and the Emperor Nero dispatched an army under the generalship of Vespasian to restore order. Unfortunately, in 68 AD, the resistance in the northern part of Israel had been eradicated, but the Romans had problems internally. While they needed to turn their full attention on Jerusalem, on the way, Emperor Nero died by his own hand, and this created a power vacuum in Rome. Vespasian then had to go back to Rome to restore order, and in the resulting chaos and a little bit of a civil war, Vespasian would be declared emperor. Titus, his son, then would take over the Israelite war, and he would lead the Roman army into the assault on Jerusalem. In 70 AD, the Romans reclaimed Jerusalem when they broke through the walls and began slaughtering hundreds of thousands of Jewish citizens. Others they sent off into slavery, and they dispersed throughout the empire. Many, for instance, were sent to the arenas to be butchered for the amusement of the public. Josephus, the historian we've spoken of several times, had this to say. He said, most of the slain were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, and they were butchered right where they were caught. The heap of corpses mounted higher and higher above the altar. A stream of blood flowed down the temple steps, and the bodies of those slain at the top slipped down to the bottom. Joseph would go on to say again, he said, while the temple was ablaze, the attackers plundered it, and countless people were caught by them, and they were slaughtered. There was no pity for age, and no regard was accorded to rank. Children and old men, laymen and priests alike were butchered. Every class was pursued and crushed in the grip of war, whether they cried out for mercy or offered resistance. And so the Roman army destroyed the second temple. And we've discussed this before. Titus did not want the temple destroyed. Why? Because Rome, first off, had helped finance all these changes Herod had made. I have a feeling that gold plates and white marble aren't cheap, and they wanted to maintain their investment. It was a source of money, and for taxes for them, it was a monument to their greatness of the power of Rome. It was also, quite frankly, a tourist attraction that made money. And so for economics and for bragging rights, they didn't want to get rid of this. Josephus again would say, as the flames had not yet penetrated the inner sanctum, but were consuming the chambers that surrounded the sanctuary, Titus assumed correctly that there was still time to save the structure, and he ran out, and by personal appeals he endeavored to persuade his men to put out the fire. But it was the soldiers, in defiance of Caesar's wishes, that set the temple on fire and saw to its ultimate destruction. And as the gold melted, the silver as well, and the rocks began to crack due to the intense heat, the soldiers would remove all of the stones to get the gold and the silver in the cracks. And as a result, when they were finished, no stones of the temple were remaining. They were quite thorough. And so it's been so thorough, in fact, that the exact location or the cornerstone of the temple structure has been debated really even today. However, evidence of the destruction does remain today, and you can see from the pictures on your screen that when they threw the stones over the side of the Temple Mount, there's clear debris fields with those stones on them. In fact, a famous archaeologist, Gabby Barclay, had this to say. He said, the stones have also added their voice. They are a testimony of what has happened. The temple's sacred relics were taken to Rome. They were put on display in celebration of the victory. They were also used as compensation, though, to build projects such as the very famous Colosseum of Rome, which, by the way, is another famous building that many people admire even still today. Only a portion of the Western Wall remains. It is a sacred site for the Jews. Many of you have seen them maybe in pictures or on the news. It's known as the Wailing Wall, and it's a place of prayer today. In 70 AD, 73 AD, the rebellion sputtered on for about 3 years past the temple destruction, but it was extinguished in 73 AD, the final fall being at the stronghold of Masada. And the Romans here, being great engineers, built a huge siege ramp to get up to the city, but before they could conquer it, over 900 Jewish holdouts, women, children, warriors, had committed suicide. So when we start our journey through Matthew 24, let's get a picture of what's going on, the feelings, the emotions, setting the stage. Jesus is walking away from the temple. The disciples are impressed by its grandeur, its architecture, but Jesus isn't impressed like they are. And it's at this time now that not only has he walked away from the temple area and the leaders and the people who have denied him as their Messiah, he is now also passing judgment as a result. Jesus' answer concerning the future of the second temple with his disciples was probably a big glass of cold water in their face. I mean, here in 1 minute, they're in awe. They're admiring all the things made by human hands and their accomplishments. And in the next moment, Jesus is telling them, hey, the whole thing's coming down. There's not going to be one stone on top of the other. And you can only imagine what they're thinking and feeling at this moment. And we're constantly reminded that we are called to much more than just earthly things or humanly things. We are called to remember that there is a spiritual life. We are to be aware of heavenly needs and to keep our focus on God. In 1 John chapter 2, we have an amazing reminder from the Apostle John, who would write the book of Revelation. He says, "Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride," notice there, the pride of life, "comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever." And here we're called to be mindful of spiritual things, God's plans, God's purposes, His will for your life. But for most of us, we live in a world that tugs and pulls at us, especially this time of year, to be amazed and to marvel the works of human hands and those things that distract us, frankly, idols, that keep us from our undevoted worship of Christ and move our eyes away. And so let me ask you again, when was the last time you were truly in awe of this earth and God's grand design? Do you admire God's beautiful creation? Do you stand and wonder at all that He's done? When you look out at some of the things that the telescopes are seeing out in the universe, do you suddenly realize how small you are and the enormity of God's creation and all that He's done? When we discover just how tightly knit things needed to be in order for creation to happen, for it to continue on, we realize that it was created by design. And if there's a design, there's a designer. And I'm not saying that building with stones and carvings and woodwork, for instance, are wrong. I know some amazing people that have enormous talents being able to do things with stone. I couldn't imagine if I wanted to. I have a friend that can make things out of wood in his wood shop that are just amazing, amazing works of art. And that's not the point. The big idea is this: what is your motivation for doing these things? Is it for God's glory or for yours? Does it point people to Christ or something else? Because we've been given talents and abilities to use for Christ's kingdom. And if you're a believer, then you've been called. And those He calls, then He equips with spiritual gifts. Every believer out there has been given spiritual gifts. And we're called to use those to build His kingdom and point people to Jesus. Are you using your spiritual gifts to build Christ's kingdom? Is the life you are building pointing people towards Jesus? Or does it point towards your greatness, your wants, your needs, desires? Who gets the glory in your salvation story? Is it you or is it God? Because remember, the Bible reminds us that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Everything we have belongs to God. We are at best stewards, Just like Adam, who was called to steward the garden and everything in it, we too have been called to steward this earth and everything in it. It all belongs to God. We are simply managing God's stuff, and that's what a steward is. A steward is somebody who manages somebody else's stuff. We are managing God's creation, His earth, His world, and we will someday give an account to Him on how we used what He gave us. How are you using what He is giving you? The last big question we have to wrestle with is, are you eternally focused or earthly focused in life? What has your time and attention? Is it the things of this world, or do you reflect on spiritual things? How much time do you give to the thoughts of God during any given day? And are the things that impress you the same things that impress God? Because at the end of this current age, the earth's going to be a completely different place. That's the point of this story that we're diving into. The second coming of Jesus, the bowls of wrath, and all that accompanies, all the signs and so forth that accompany that indicate that there's an enormous transformative impact on the geography and the terrain and the population of this earth. People will be scarce, and it will be very different out there. We will begin a new age. It's much like after the flood of Noah. Don't miss that part of the story. And then at the very end, sometime after the millennial kingdom, there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and this current earth and all that is in it will be laid bare. Believers in Christ are called to hold on to hope. This is not a story of despair. It is a story of hope. Yes, change is coming. It will be transformative. It will be bad for some. It will be a cataclysmic event. But our hope does not rest in the things of this world, but on heavenly things. What is that hope? Well, we're reminded, for instance, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, that we have a building from God, a house not made with hands. It is eternal in the heavens. As remember, Jesus told us in John, He said, I'm going to prepare a place for you. As Jesus often does, He's going to move this conversation towards God's plans and away from our plans. He's moving us from earthly things to spiritual things. And He'll warn us not to be deceived. That's what's coming up next as we learn. Several times in Matthew 24, He warns us, do not be deceived. Do not be led astray. Some will turn away from the faith. Others will be tested. Why? Because come to find out that some people, while they still claim to love Jesus, have their eyes on earthly matters. And He's trying to remind us that if you are genuinely a follower of Jesus Christ, He is your King, and He's calling the shots in life. We exist to steward His creation, His people, and His things for which we will give an account. And so for some, rather than godly living and spiritual things, they are still focused on earthly living. And they are living, as the Bible remembered, by their senses. If it looks good, feels good, sounds good, tastes good, it must be good. We are called to live in the Spirit. God's will, God's way. And so how about you? We go back to that original question, what impresses you? Especially this holiday season. Is it the things of this world? Or is it a loving God who loved us so much that He sent His Son to make a way for us to be reconnected back to the Father? A Father who is generous and wants to give His children eternal life. And so as we sign out today, next week, you are not going to want to miss this podcast. We're going to be left with one last big controversial question as Jesus is walking away from the temple. Because there's a lot of talk out there about rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, and many people would love to see that happen. However, does that align with our beliefs? For those who are followers of Jesus Christ, should a Christian support the rebuilding of the Jewish temple? Let's see if we can't get ourselves into some trouble. Tune in next week. Should be a good one. I love you. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.